So over a year ago, back in February of 2023, I released a video detailing how live services are dying by the dozen as the genre buckles from unsustainable oversaturation. And fast forward roughly a year and a half, and you want to know what's changed since? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Companies are still in this gold rush to become the next big live service, to try to become the next Destiny 2. But a lot of those ideas are either uninspired or not competitive enough with what's currently the standard for that stuff to stand out. So guess what? There's been just another round of mass shutdown of live services, or live services that you can tell are going to shut down sooner or later. This discussion kind of cropped up again with the shutdown or the end of support for Exoprimal. This is a game that was released by Capcom, and it was announced on July 5th, 2024, that all planned Exoprimal seasonal content has been finished. Exoprimal, for those who don't know, is this dinosaur shooter game that can be best described as like a mix between Anthem and Dino Crisis, I guess, except instead of just making Dino Crisis, they made Exoprimal. And it had some neat things going for it, but ultimately it wasn't a compelling enough title for it to be able to stand out. And so the end of support came, and various news outlets sort of began talking about how this should be a lesson to live service developers, or how this is just another casualty in this trend. And what is gaming's worst trend is kind of the opinion that's out there of trying to push live services out there for the sake of having a live service there to recurrently monetize, rather than have a genuinely inspired idea that makes sense for the live service genre where it can shine as a live service. And so I want to detail the next round of games where it's highly likely to already determine that they just don't have a future, and it's going to be a big waste of time and money, and the ones who are going to suffer are the developers, who just were doing what the captain told them, only to be led astray. Let's start by looking at multiverses. Now, what's interesting about this game is that, I mean, look, you can see right here from the player numbers that it's trending downwards, and it's slowly starting to die off. What's interesting about this particular game is that it would be its second death. You may recall that this game launched all the way back in summer of 2022. It peaked to great numbers, but that fell off real hard, and eventually people just stopped playing it. And if you look at the graph of this latest release, it's the same trend of like it peaked pretty high for like a day or two, for a couple days. And now it's the rate at which the player base is diminishing is rather alarming for a live service, one that's free to play at that, and that requires a consistent stream of players to be engaged and in turn spend money on this game for this to be viable. It looks like it's headed down the same path as the first time around, when it basically died off unceremoniously. I don't suspect multiverses, unless they make some radical changes and radical additions, will really last all that long, if I'm being honest with you. And what really didn't help matters for multiverses is that its final release somehow was less feature complete than the beta, and had issues that the beta didn't have, and so it just released in a poor state that didn't feel like a huge enough step up from the beta for it to be something that revitalized the player base's belief in multiverse's capability to kind of compete against your Super Smash Brothers or your, Brawlhallas even. Then let's talk about Skull and Bones. Back in February of 2024, it was reported that this game from Ubisoft, the so-called quadruple A game, had less than 1 million players total, including free trial players as of this day, meaning that a lot of people kind of tried the game out and decided, yeah, I'm not going to buy this. And even including those free trial players, the number of players engaging with this game was minuscule enough that I don't suspect that this is a game that is going to have long legs, unless Ubisoft somehow manages to pull off like a For Honor or a Rainbow Six Siege level comeback, which I guess Ubisoft has done before, but that is the exception, not the rule. Redfall fell, no pun intended, not too long ago when it was announced on May 30th, 2024, that Arcane Austin would be bidding farewell to Redfall with the final update. This was after Xbox decided to shut down Arcane Austin alongside with Tango Gameworks and other studios. The final update did include the offline mode that this game desperately needed for it to be preserved, so kudos there. But that aside, like, the game was just unceremonious all throughout. People didn't really like the announcement. The marketing didn't particularly entice players, and then the final game, the reviews and the feedback surrounding it didn't indicate that this was going to be a successful live service, and Redfall fell pretty hard. And then, of course, the shutdown of Arcane Austin was the kind of final nail in the coffin. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is now free to claim for Prime Day when a live service is so desperate that they are already making free offers. And, you know, this is months after its launch. One that's not free to play, mind you. This is a premium priced live service where you do have an initial price tag you have to pay to access it. That's already a bad sign, combined with the fact that if you look at its player base and look at how many people are engaging with the game right now, you'll find low triple-digit players over the course of 24 hours. This right here is as good as dead, and there have been a couple updates that have rolled out, but that stuff has not been enough to really bolster player numbers because the updates just don't feel all that substantial. They had one chance with the Season 1 and Joker DLC to show that their upcoming content will be thrilling and exciting, but Season 1 and Joker DLC, that did not go down well at all, and it highlighted that the developers are only barely able to keep up with the game's live service requirements. They're barely able to make content, and when they do, it's a lot of rehash stuff because they just haven't built a solid foundations to make this a viable long-term game. Next up, let's take a look at Foam Stars from Square Enix, which, I mean, it took a lot of inspiration from Splatoon. And it's the fact that they were trying to replicate something and, you know, give it a twist of their own, but it ultimately just didn't stand out enough. And then its quality, while it wasn't a bad game by any means, it just wasn't outstanding. It didn't have the personality that Splatoon did. It just wasn't as refined as Splatoon was. Ultimately, the player base just dipped tremendously throughout the course of its lifespan, to the point where by April of 2024, Foam Stars lost nearly 95% of its player base. And while they haven't announced like a shutdown of the game or an end of service or an end of support, I do suspect that that announcement will be coming pretty soon, and that the vast majority of people won't be surprised to hear this. And I think a lot of people will be like, huh, Foam Stars, what even is that? I don't think a lot of people really have heard of this game. And if they have, they've, you know, long forgotten about it and moved on to all the other live services that are out there that are huge time sinks. Companies have the expectation that people just have unlimited time to spend on all of these live services, and unlimited money for that matter. But there are only so many people on this planet, and of those people, only so much time can be spent on one or two games that require you to treat them as full-time jobs to stay fully sort of updated and to keep up with all of the rewards and all the timed FOMO content that they put out there. Rocket Arena is next. This game did last a couple years at least. It was released on July 14th, 2020, but it was recently announced that the game would shut down. Rocket Arena was sunset on March 21st, 2024. Honestly, this is one game that it was from EA, and it's one that I just haven't looked too much into. I think I remember seeing like a trailer for it back in the day, but it just didn't interest me enough to really check it out. But alas, it's a game that didn't have long enough legs. Moving on, we have this July 11th, 2024 announcement that Tencent is shutting down its free-to-play shooter Synced after just a year. Literally, exactly a year after its release is when this game will be shut down on September 8th, 2024 at 7 p.m. I don't know much about Synced, I'll be honest. If there was marketing for this game, I must have missed it. This is one of those like, who situations. But yeah, again, the market is so oversaturated that there are times where you will just not hear about certain games because there's so many to keep track of, or because the marketing team just failed to really spread word about these titles. As for some of the more successful live services that have come out, every once in a while you do get a new live service that does manage to kind of market itself just right or hit just right, where a lot of people do check it out. Among them is The First Descendant, though if you look at its critical reception, already mixed at 53% on Steam from almost 60,000 reviews. That indicates that unless they do something to spruce the game up, it might be a pretty quick descent, akin to what we saw with like Multiverses. And it doesn't help that the scores surrounding The First Ascent are pretty not great, sitting at a 57% from 13 critic reviews, and the user scores at a 4.9 on Metacritic, combined with the mixed score on Steam from tens of thousands of people. But currently, if you look at the player numbers, the all-time peak, 264,860 players. That's like a dream launch scenario for a live service. And so far, in what little time this game has been out, the people who play this game are consistently coming back. But I've heard that this game just is kind of bland and lackluster in certain areas, and that it's grindy in ways that are not necessarily fun. Not to mention that when it comes to, I guess, its primary competition, it is kind of trying to be its own version of Warframe to a degree. And Warframe is already so well established, and that is a game whose updates have proven to be so substantial that every time a major new update comes out, it like transforms the game. To compete against that, The First Ascendant, its cadence of high-quality new content releases will have to be, competitive with that. And so unless it does that, I can see these numbers drop off fairly quickly over the course of the next few weeks. But this is one of those, we'll see. We'll have to wait and see scenarios. And then we have Destiny 2, which is in many ways the mother of live service looter shooters. The Destiny IP, I think, has been out the longest as far as that particular genre goes, and it's what inspired a lot of businesses to try to essentially replicate its success. And with the final shape having been so well received, the player numbers peaked at almost the all-time peak that it was at previously in the last month, and in recent months, and recent days, we're seeing players in the tens to hundreds of thousands. So this is a game that's doing well and who went off with a bang thanks to a great final DLC. Zenless Zone Zero, this is from MiHoYo, and at this point, with the success of Genshin and then Honkai Star Rail, MiHoYo is just too big to fail now. Like any new game they output, I think people will be on board for this particular fan base. So Zenless Zone Zero managed to accrue 50 million downloads worldwide in a very short amount of time. And that does not surprise me one bit. So MiHoYo at this point is established enough as a company and brand that their live services, new ones, will succeed. Helldivers 2 was kind of, I think, a surprise hit when, the numbers peaked to almost over 450,000 players. And on PlayStation 5, we don't know what those numbers look like. This was a massive success, but we are seeing a decline of players. We're seeing players move on. Ultimately, while Helldivers 2 can be fun for some time, its cadence of releases, of content updates are too small, and they need an expansion-sized update, I think, to really rekindle the fire of this player base. There's only so much you can do in terms of variety of activities in this game before people realize they're kind of starting to do the same thing over and over again, and there's just not enough rewards and things to look forward to grind for. And then one last game I want to look at is X Defiant from Ubisoft, which is essentially their take on a Call of Duty-like experience. And this is a game that has gone on to do pretty well for itself, unlike, say, Skull and Bones. It's like the complete opposite. X Defiant has been sort of breaking milestones every so often, every few weeks, and most recently it was stated by Yves Guillemot that X Defiant has attracted 11 million players. How many of those are sort of continuously coming back to play X Defiant in terms of concurrent player numbers? What kind of numbers we're seeing there, and how many people engage with this game at the same time? We don't know those stats, but 11 million players checking a game out is substantial, and I'll be curious to see whether these results will continue or whether this will flatline and fall off. But when it comes to Ubisoft branded shooters, Rainbow Six Siege went to do pretty well. X Defiant has a strong start, and if Ubisoft does what they did with the likes of Rainbow Six Siege and For Honor, it could very well thrive. So not to say that it's completely unviable to enter the live service market, but you either have to chase a trend so well and have to market a game so well that it attracts enough attention, and then the content itself, the quality is good enough that it retains that attention and it spreads word of mouth, or you have to deliver something really inspired, something that feels kind of fresh and something that everyone will want to talk about and play with other friends with. I think Helldivers 2, that initial wave of hype, and that did sustain itself for some time. You know, a lot of people just felt like Helldivers 2 really felt like just something kind of different. Like, yes, it's a shooter, but the whole Starship Troopers vibe combined with all of the shenanigans that can ensue during a play session and just the identity that it had that was very unique to itself and very self-aware, and just the kind of fun chaos that could plague any session for better and for worse. All of that made Helldivers 2 just feel like the game that was talked about during the time that sort of peaked in terms of its hype and reception. Again, that's fallen off since because I do think the developers didn't expect the level of success that it attained, so they weren't prepared for the kind of content cadence that this kind of success would require. So I think they're now just kind of building the foundation for that. But that is an example of a game that, you know, it was like a bit of an underdog, but people found it, they talked about it, word of mouth spread, and it wasn't just your typical like thing copying something else, the thing that was just kind of going for a generic version of something that already exists that's just better than the new product that they're trying to make, which is the fear surrounding Concord that while this is not a bad game based on impressions surrounding its beta, a lot of people do feel like maybe this is a genre of live service that's a little too late. The Washington Post said Concord is Sony's expertly crafted big bet. It's just a few years late. And the reception surrounding this game has generally been mixed. Nobody's saying it's abysmal or anything, but nobody's saying that it's a standout either. And if something is not a standout from a live service genre perspective, and it doesn't capture an audience immediately from day one and then keep that audience and have that audience grow, then it's doomed to fail. It's doomed to shut down. It's doomed to peter out unceremoniously. And yet, despite all of this, we're seeing companies like PlayStation going kind of crazy. At one point, they were working on 12 live service games that they wanted to ship over the years. Eventually, PlayStation, realizing that this level of live service saturation from a single company is practically suicidal, eventually decided to cut that number in half, at least in terms of what's releasing within a certain time frame. Like, those other 6 are still being planned for release down the line, but they're kind of slowing down their roll and focusing more on a fewer quantity of games instead of trying to shotgun their way through 12 freaking live services, which is just an insane amount of live services from any one company. Even from different companies, 12 live services over the span of a couple years is still a lot. But Sony by itself trying to release 12 live services, freaking actually nuts, in a way that's not inspired, in a way that just feels really, really dumb. Now, we did see on December of 2023 that they did shut down The Last of Us Online. The quality just wasn't there, and Naughty Dog just decided that they're better off being focused on what they do best, which is single-player, campaign-driven, story-heavy experiences. Because, I mean, have we not learned the lesson at this point of what happens when you take a company, a studio that is specialized, that are really good at making single-player campaign experiences? When you take your BioWares, when you take your Crystal Dynamics, when you take your Arcane Austins and throw them into the live service looter genre and expect them to make something that's as competitive and that can match the stuff that comes from companies who've had live service experience for many, many years and who've been able to update that live service for many years and make them much more full and substantial. Like that's a doomed kind of project. That's a doomed kind of endeavor. when you're dealing with studios that just aren't used to developing in that kind of environment. And so I think it was smart for Naughty Dog to decide to back off on this huge Last of Us Online live service experience. But I wonder if Sony will be smart enough to not output 6 to 12 live services throughout the course of upcoming years. By fiscal year ending in March 2026. So within the span of 2 years, they initially had the plan to release 12 live services. Even half that, even 6 live services in the span of 2 years is an insane number. And I mean, it feels like they're just throwing darts at the board and hoping that one of them will hit a bullseye in the dark. But I don't know if that kind of approach will yield results. I don't know if something like Concord will take off. I think that will be maybe the litmus test of whether this is something that will work for Sony. And if Concord doesn't end up doing well, I think Sony may back off further on those plans, realizing that this kind of oversaturation and this kind of rushing towards live services in vast quantities, instead of taking the time to consider what one big major endeavor they can pursue that makes sense for a live service and that is genuinely inspired, they can invest in. This just feels like, again, like a gold rush race rather than something considered and something that is coming from an artistic and creative perspective. But this is kind of the current state of live services right now, ladies and gentlemen. A handful still can slip through and take off and whatever. But even then, the question of can that maintain itself and, can that not suffer the massive declines that a lot of these tend to suffer? That remains to be seen. And the race towards infusing the market with more live services is far from over. And it's one that's going to result in a lot of failed projects for just no good reason, from a lack of foresight, from just sheer short-sightedness. The market getting more and more saturated with these kinds of games. It's going to be harder and harder for any one live service to stand out and succeed. But I'll be curious to see where some of these live services end up, in a year or two or a couple of years from now. In the meantime, though, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the recent cadence of release of live services, and whether you think that this is viable and whether there's certain live services that are doing it right, and what you think about just all the shutdowns versus some of the ones that do manage to take off and succeed here and there. So let me know in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.